Okay. Let's talk about Jake something. So we already talked about it at the top of the show, but the Jake something, the former Jake something, and now Jake Doyle has signed with All Elite Wrestling. He debuted last night in a backstage segment where he attacked Jet Speed, Kevin Knight, and the former TNA star Speedball Mike Bailey. And who also Speedball is Jake's tag team partner in DPW. Interesting note. But him and his new tag team partner, Mark Davis of the former Aussie Open tag team, Kyle Fletcher's old tag team partner. You got these two big, thick, beefy bastards who can really go. Like they're really good pro wrestlers, both of these guys. And they decided to go ahead and get rid of the Jake something name, and he's going to go by Jake Doyle now. I think that might actually just be his name. I'm not really too sure. Like I don't know that you would just like do a name generator and Doyle comes up. So unless of course Tony Khan is a fan of Happy Gilmore or not Happy, I'm Billy Madison like I am, and he's like Doyle rules, and maybe they're just doing that instead of calling him Doyle, they're doing Doyle. Maybe I don't know, but I like the name. I like the name change. I like the haircut. I like the fact that he was wearing clothes. you know, he was his presentation in TNA was always just the guy that never wore clothes. so much so that BQ called him Naked Jake. And they immediately put him in with the Don Callis family. He's part of a tag team, and they had him attack Jet Speed, and then later in the evening they had him attack the Young Bucks. And so now I think that you got two matches right there, maybe even two feuds for them to sink their teeth into. I would be curious to see if they beat Jet Speed, because I think Jet Speed is primed for FTR. So if you're bringing Jake in and you're forming this new tag team with Mark Davis, if they immediately lose to a team like Jet Speed, that tells me that you're not really getting behind the team, at least not right away. Like maybe later you will, but the outpouring of support online for Jake should really make them think that this tag team is something that they should get behind. And I hope that they do, because I think that Jake is a great talent. So let's talk about the name. The name Jake something I always felt was, I think the word was used, an albatross. Like it was something that always held him back. He had the name, and I think like the average person is like, why is he called that? That's stupid, right? Sometimes a unique name, like Mike Awesome. I thought that Mike Awesome was like a cool name. Like, that guy is awesome. You see him and he's awesome. Like that makes sense, right? Jake something. What does that even mean, right? It tells me that you just couldn't come up with a name. You don't like your last name. Like I don't know. I think it distracts from how great Jake is, and it always was kind of something that was holding him back. And people would make fun of his name rather than celebrate how great he is. And I could see promoters and TV writers and fans and viewers struggling getting past that, and he already has, as far as like television big room charisma, like he does like all the flexing and the growling and the yelling and that stuff, which is more old school 1980s style. But he didn't, in his promos, he didn't really have a ton of charisma with the promos, and so he's already got that holding him back. And then now his name's Jake something. It's like that's two strikes. And so I get the feeling that TNA struggled to write stories for him, and that's why they started and stopped all the time, because they just weren't creative enough to kind of bypass some of his very minor limitations. So in AEW, they just killed the name immediately, which I think was a plus, and they put clothes on him, and now he's far more interesting than he was in TNA. And now he's just a big beefy bastard that's part of the Don Callis family. Now I do see limitations being a part of that family because they got so many guys, right? Already in AEW you have a ton of people, right? So, and they're very top heavy, and like their middle card is very heavy. So it's going to be very difficult for him to break through and become a featured act and a featured player. He might get pushed right away and then probably scale down the card, and then he would be stagnant for a while, and then he's just going to have to work his way up from there, which has been the pattern with a lot of new AEW signings that aren't super famous. Like we've seen that with Deanna. And Deanna came in, got a push right away, got a title shot, and then got descaled down the card and hasn't really been able to work her way back up and impress Tony enough to put her back. And some people will say, well, Tony just hates her or he's a bad book. I don't think any of that's true. I think that he's probably waiting for something to click with her and for her to click with the audience for them to bring her back up, because he does, push, scale back down, and then come up with an idea and then bring them back to the forefront. That's kind of like the pattern in that company. And if you don't really end up clicking with the audience, you'd never really make your way back up. That could happen with Jake. I don't know. So I think that he does have an uphill battle to climb being in that company, because there's so many great wrestlers. And he's coming in as this big muscular guy, but he's not the biggest or the most muscular guy even in the Don Callis family. So, he's more muscular than Mark Davis, but he's not bigger than Mark Davis. He's smaller than Lance Archer, and he's less famous than all of them. so he's got some uphill battles to climb, but I think he's talented enough to get through some of those things. And I think that, the name change and the uniform change is already helping him, and he's got a lot of people on the internet that have his back, and that is important to Tony Khan. That was not important to TNA, but that is important to Tony Khan, because he sees a lot of the internet as some of his main consumer base, and that makes sense. AEW, they do have their stuff for like the casuals, right? Like you Tony Storm, and you got Mercedes Moné and her puppets, and then you got you got Edge and Christian and all these other guys from WWE. Like that's who they're trying to service the casual fans. But then like what he really likes to sink his teeth into is impressing those hardcore fans, and the people that he sees as his biggest supporters, and his biggest supporters support Jake, and they have been talking about Jake for a long time, hoping that Jake will leave TNA and that Jake should be the TNA champion. And they said the same thing about Speedball and Taurus. And if you look at how Taurus and Speedball are being booked right now, I think they said the same thing about Josh Alexander. If you see how Speedball, Taurus, and Josh Alexander are being booked right now, I think you kind of see the future for Jake. And I'll let you determine whether or not that's good or bad. If you think Jake should have been the world champion in TNA, do you think he should be the world champion in AEW? I don't think so. And I like Jake. I'm a fan of his. But do you think that he should be above MJF? Probably not, right? Who would you put him over in that company? And so he's going to have to prove himself. And the guy's like 36 years old, and, and he's kind of starting from scratch now, if you think about it, because he's got a new name, and he's with Don Callis, and I'm curious to see where it goes. All right, let's get to some comments here. So, excuse me. Gerard says no length. So talking about Ali, no length. Said he gets a nice paycheck and created freedom to keep doing his thing. And value his time that he has left in pro wrestling and wants to be used properly. Well, I think that TNA has been using him properly. For all the negative things we said about Jake Something's, the way Jake Something was being booked in TNA and Black Taurus, if anybody says the Speedball wasn't being booked well in TNA, they clearly weren't watching, because he was booked very well in TNA. He had a great run in TNA. He didn't leave because he wasn't being booked well. He left because AEW's probably offered him more money, right? And I think that he was being booked better in TNA than he's being booked in AEW. I think, and I like the tag team of Jet Speed, but I just see Speedball as like an upper mid card, occasional TV main event level star, and he had great matches in the C2, and he was able to do some of that stuff. So. But anybody that says Speedball wasn't being booked well in TNA, they have no idea what they're talking about. But Taurus and Jake, I'll give it to you. Like, absolutely, I'll give it to you. They were booked terribly. And Jake was there for like almost 8 years, and he never held the title. He had a couple of TV main events. He challenged for the IWGP title against Sonata, and that was a really good match. And every time we thought they were going to get behind him, they ended up stopping for whatever reason. I don't know why. I've never seen a guy get repackaged so many times, start and stop pushes. Like for TNA fans that say that he should have stayed with TNA and that he was better off in TNA, you guys clearly don't watch him either because they've tried with him for years and they just could not figure out how to get this guy to break through. They couldn't figure it out. And I'll never understand it. It's like, how is this guy so hard to book? You know? And you might criticize what he's going to be booked in AEW, but AEW has a much larger roster, and Tony Khan is not going to focus a lot of his energy on what Jake's doing, right? He's just not, unless Jake really clicks with the audience and like starts to get over naturally. He's probably not going to do that because he has so many other people to focus on, people that actually drive business for him, and Jake's just not there yet, so he's going to have to work his way up. But let's see. Godzilla says, took 5 minutes for AEW to do more with him than TNA did in 5 years. He's certainly more interesting now, for sure. And then hopefully they see in Bear what they should have seen in Jake. I think the one advantage that Bear has over Jake, he has a couple advantages. And the first advantage is that he was on AEW TV for years, while Jake never had any top-level TV experience with WWE or AEW. Bear at least had AEW. And believe it or not, means something to TNA. Should it? I don't think that you should need that in order to get over in TNA, but I think that they value that. Clearly by the people they've been pushed, right? Look at the way Mike Santana is being pushed. And it's because they like the fact that he came off AEW TV and now he's with them, right? So Bear has that advantage. And B, based off of some of his promos, I think Bear has some charisma that Jake just didn't have, right? Bear can actually tell a story with his promos. Well, Jake says, I'm big man, I'm strong man, I beat you up. Like, I think Bear can get into some depth, right? Like, I think there's depth to his character to where Jake something there was no character. I think Bear actually kind of has like some personality and some character that Jake just didn't have. I think Jake was the better worker, right? But in TNA, that doesn't really mean as much. And that's not to say that Bear isn't a good worker. I think he is. But I think Jake did some of the more impressive stuff that you get out of GIFs and memes and, bullshit. And Bear doesn't do that, right? Bear's strictly a brawler. But let's see. This is some simple shit that TNA couldn't figure out with Jake. All the stuff he's done. And then he says, this is about Ali. Basically, his idea is working with creative. Yeah, so I get the feeling that Ali has a big say and a big hand in everything that he's doing. So, but let's put a pin in the Jay conversation. I think that, it was... he had 8 years with the company, and I don't want to say they're a waste because, he worked the whole time, he got paid the whole time, and he had some big matches for the company, but they sure didn't get behind him the way that they should have. I thought they had a really good blue chip prospect talent, and, he's 36 years old. They had him when he was in his late 20s, and he should have been pushed to the top like right away. And if he doesn't have a character of his own, they should have been creative enough to come up with something for him to make it work because he's that talented. And Jake might not be the most creative guy. Obviously his name's Jake something. So it's not a very creative name. But they should have come up with something for him, and they didn't, and I think that's ultimately going to be a fail, and it's been across multiple regimes. Some people say Scott D'Amore booked him better. I think Scott D'Amore had him in some bigger matches, but he was never anything sustainable as far as a feud goes. Under Scott's regime, he is a Scott D'Amore guy. He, worked a lot of the Maple Leaf shows and the Border City shows and all that stuff. But I don't think Scott D'Amore booked him very well either. In fact, they had him doing the cousin Jake shit, like with Cody Deaner, and then they turned him into Jake something. And then I was like, hey, we're finally going to get a push with this guy. And we started, he would get a little bit of a push, and then he'd be back down a little. He would get an X Division title shot and back down, and get a world title shot. He's back down, and nothing was sustained. Right. He didn't have any blood feuds. He didn't have anything like that. Right. No, like they didn't do any in-depth storylines with him. Let me see. Beto says, I legitimately remember one story involving him. Yeah. He didn't really have any like storylines that you could sink your teeth into. under any regime. Then Scott leaves and Ariel comes in, and it's the same thing. It's like, hey, we got this guy. He's so impressive. Let's push him. They start to push him, and then like nothing. And then same thing happens. Ariel gets fired, and now you got Delirious taking over the book, and same thing, right? And then you saw what happened last year with the Frankie Kazarian thing. We thought that something's gonna happen with him and Frankie, and that was back in that was back in September.